So good morning, Tim.
Let's say good morning to Tim. Is it Wendel or Wendell, Tim?
It is Wendell, guys. I'm intrigued by that hat. I must admit, I'm going back to that. Anyway, no, it's great to be with you guys.
Have you seen John's hat?
No.
Have you seen Indiana Jones? It looks like the hat Indiana Jones wears.
Looks like he's like wascally rabbits are scared when he puts it on.
Tell us about Rebel Falls, sir.
Rebel Falls. First of all, great to be with you guys. Sorry, I was out trying to dig my car out of the ice some more. But
all of us.
But Rebel Falls is set in 1864. Pretty much everybody, the way we're taught about the Civil War, I think in high school or even in college, is okay. The war's winding down. It's about over. Union's going to win. Lee's besieged in Petersburg outside of Richmond, etc. But what people don't realize, and I didn't, is there was an extensive Confederate spy network that extended from the maritime provinces along our Canadian border to outside of Detroit. And even John Wilkes Booth was somewhat involved in this at one point. And they were trying and nearly succeeded to create an international incident or two. You had the robberies at St. Albans in Vermont, but I'm focusing on Rebel Falls, on how two guys named Bell and Burley, Bell, who grew up near Charlestown, West Virginia, were scheming to seize the USS Michigan. And if they had seized the USS Michigan, the only remaining Union warship left on the Great Lakes at that point, they planned to bombard Toledo, Cleveland, Erie, Buffalo on the eve of the presidential election in 1864. And Lincoln probably would have lost. So you have all this intrigue along our border with Canada at that point in time, which you hardly ever read about in the history books. Bell and Burley are mentioned in passing in Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. They are mentioned a little bit in Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, but what they pulled off could have potentially reversed the balance of the war as was coming down the home stretch in 1864.
Now, your book is fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that part you just mentioned is nonfiction.
Yes, pretty much all the characters, Bell, John Yates Bell, Bennett Burley, the Northwest Conspiracy of the Confederacy, obviously John Wilkes Booth, they're all based on real folks. William Seward, who's then Secretary of State for the U.S., is obviously a real person. So with a few exceptions, in a sense, the events and the people are based on real events, which is something I kind of used from, say, our friend Tom Mallon, and some of the great historical novels he's done, like Henry and Clara, etc., where it's fun to do a lot of, I think, research in doing this book. Went to London, where Bennett Burley was from. He was from actually Glasgow, originally a soldier of fortune. So yes, to answer the question, these guys almost to a person are based on true people, and Rebel Falls is based upon true events.
So the Canadian involvement for the Confederacy, is this kind of an extension of the War of 1812, that the Brits were still angry?
Yeah, somewhat. What it was, it was an extension of that, and in a sense, Canada being somewhat this kind of rogue partner or player at this point in time. And obviously they were still part of Britain. They were British Canada. And what I find intriguing about it is even today, and I can say this in part because my wife's Canadian. You've met her at the author's dinner. There tends to be this, even today, that while Canada is so innocent and benign, and they were called the North Star during, say, certainly the years before the Civil War, as freedom seekers are trying to escape the South, and the only place they could have true freedom was in Canada, in British Canada. But even during this point in 1864, you had a lot of factions within Canada that were pro-South. Several of the newspapers are very much sided with the Confederacy. You had some of the Catholic churches in Montreal, believe it or not, were sided with the Confederacy. And when John Wilkes Booth is captured 12 days after assassinating President Lincoln, a little bit later in 1864, he's shot during that event and soon dies, but they empty his pockets and they find change, a pocket knife. They find this diary, which is kind of bizarre, where he thinks he's going to be greeted as a savior once he gets below the Mason-Dixon line. But the thing that blows their mind is they find a note for a significant sum, several $1,000s, from a bank in Montreal. A lot of the money that was being funneled to help this Northwest conspiracy, help these rebel spies along our northern border with Canada, was being funneled through mostly Montreal and the banks there. In fact, there was a hotel there called the Lawrence Hall, which was pretty much all Confederate sympathizers and spies. It was sounded like something out of Casablanca, everybody goes to Rick's. In that case, everybody was going to the Lawrence Hall. So it kind of cuts both ways. And even Jefferson Davis, after he gets out of prison, the former Confederate president, of course, he goes to Montreal and is greeted as a conquering hero. I mean, there's huge crowds. So Canada at times likes to say its history was, we were just pro-union and very much for helping freedom seekers escape slaves. But there was a significant factions in the country at that point, which, extension of things that had happened previously that were very much pro-South.
I was not aware of that.
So is Canada,
bizarre.
You say they were pro-South. Were they pro-South because...
There was pockets of pro-South, not Canada, right?
Right. There was pockets of it, and a lot of it had to do with economic, some industries, some newspapers felt it would be better off if the South won or the South was its own country. And in a way, this is what England was going back and forth on a little bit too. Do we recognize the South? Certainly in the early years of the Civil War, 61, 62, it would have been easier to do, have Great Britain or England recognize the Confederacy as its own nation because it was doing so well. That kind of reverses, obviously, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg and things like that. And so this is kind of the swirl that Rebel Falls takes place in, and much of it is real life. And this is one of the things Secretary Seward and Secretary Stanton, the Secretary of War for the North, they're trying to grapple with. It kind of blew their minds that, hang on, we've got these rebel spies and this extensive spy network along our northern border. We better crank things up. And they did, and actually used some of the old Underground Railroad individuals and even locations to try to win this war of espionage. There was a great old hotel in Niagara Falls called the Cataract House, which was like the last jumping off point in the years before the war. And so much so they helped thousands of freedom seekers escape that final distance, literally that last river to cross right there at Niagara Falls and the Niagara River to get them to Canada. And one of the things I did in researching Rebel Falls is that some great museums and archives in Niagara Falls, and just found, ledgers of books where, in 1859, we spirited these folks. They would either row them across the river, which I find mind-boggling, because anybody who's been to Niagara Falls, there's rapids and everything there, or they would get them across on the suspension bridge, which was the only bridge at that point, the only span across the Niagara River. And you can find, these records of how many freedom seekers or escaped slaves they helped out.
So how did you stumble on this idea? How did you find this? I studied the Civil War. I was a Civil War history major in undergraduate school, and I was not aware of this spy network at all. So how did you stumble upon this?
I stumbled upon it, John. I'm not as learned as you are in the Civil War, but I grew up near the Canadian border. I grew up in Lockport, New York, which is only about 15 miles almost due east of Niagara Falls. My dad loved Niagara Falls. We'd go visit there all the time. He found it one of the wonders of the world. And so like you, when I started to hear about this spy network and these two individuals, John Yates Bell, who went to University of Virginia, was very much pro-South, actually was he in a sense was a pirate, so to speak, privateer on Chesapeake Bay early on in the war, and then heard about his accomplice, a guy named Bennett Burleigh. As I said before, a soldier of fortune, came from Scotland. I stumbled across them just in passing at first in teams of rivals. And they jump out just a bit, Bell especially, because Bell is one of the few individuals that Abraham Lincoln did not pardon. Abraham Lincoln was notorious for pardoning everybody, pretty much. In fact, it got to be, it aggravated some folks. It got to be a bit of a joke in his White House. But he did not pardon Bell. And he did not pardon Bell in part because he was getting so much pressure from authorities in New York after the draft riots and some of the things that have gone up there, saying they were pretty much saying he's a bad cat. You can't, in a sense, forgive him. And so Lincoln did not pardon John Yates Bell. And this is where history's fun. And is John Yates Bell and John Wilkes Booth, a lot of Johns, they crossed paths several times before the war and even as the war was going. We're pretty sure they met at the hanging of John Brown in Harper's Ferry in 1859. So I'm stumbling across this, and I'm going, I've never heard of these guys. And like you, I'm going, I should have been taught this in school. The Civil War would have been a little bit more interesting, and maybe I would have done better on my tests and such. And because it happened so close to where I grew up, in Lockport, that I kept teasing it out and had the contacts, say, at the museums, certainly in Niagara Falls and then elsewhere, and it just kept adding up. I mentioned London earlier, and Bennett Burleigh was, again, he was Scottish, and he escaped after the war and went back to England, back to London. And I was at the British Museum, and I just kind of wandered in there. My son used to work in London. And I went in and asked the researcher, do you have anything on this guy named Bennett Burleigh? And I was spelling his last name Burley. And they went, they looked around, and the woman researcher came back. She said, sorry, I've got nothing on this guy. I went, oh, well, that's too bad. But then this is why I love librarians and researchers. They often keep going when I quit. And she said, but this name's familiar. Let's try spelling the last name a little differently. Let's try Burleigh. I went, okay, knock yourself out. And she disappears, comes back with this thick file. And I went, oh, we're onto something now. And Bennett Burleigh, when he escaped our Civil War and ended up back in London and Great Britain, he did change the spelling of his last name. And he became one of the most accomplished war correspondents for the London Daily Telegraph. He wrote like 15 to 20 books. And all of a sudden, here's the guy who escapes our war and then recasts himself as this amazing correspondent. And so time and again in writing Rebel Falls, this is where circumstances or fate would lead me. And part of it was going back, like you, John, I shared this kind of, I don't know, hunger or just surprise that where were these guys in my high school textbook?
That is a terrible alias.
What?
Bennett Burleigh to Bennett Burleigh.
Well,
did nobody put that together back then?
Nobody put it back together. He had quite the ego, so I think he just wanted to keep the same initials. Well, but it threw me for a while.
Martinsburg has famous history with Confederate spies with Bell Boyd and this area. So this is a fascinating topic.
And Charlestown with
of course,
John Brown, right?
Yeah, it kind of makes me.
In fact, that courthouse is across the street from your office.
That's right. And it's where we try cases a lot of times. I was thinking about when you were talking about, like, I wonder if there was some events that happened in Charlestown that influenced John Wilkes Booth's trajectory and his thinking on either his sympathies. Maybe he thought it was a cruel act of what had happened to John Brown. He's famous for putting on shows while he was in town to entertain the troops, which was common, wasn't showing off or anything, and reading Shakespeare there on Liberty Street at one of the establishments. So it's just, who knows what emanated out of that.
It could have affected the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
very
yeah.
much. Very much.
It's and other acts.
Sure. The ripples that go out from the stone, right?
Our guest is Tim Wendel. He's written a book called Rebel Falls. Yet another entry in the Civil War. There is no end to the number of stories that can be told that are set in the Civil War that are in fact factual. So how do people get in touch with you, get in touch with the book? Are you doing any local events here? This is sort of the Civil War capital of the of the country.
Yeah. And Tim, we have about 2 minutes left, by the way, just so you know the time.
Oh,
frame.
yeah, no worries. No, people can reach out to me. The website is Tim Wendel, all one word, and Wendel is WENDEL.com, and there's a contact button, and there's stuff about Rebel Falls there. And like you guys, I've been kind of trucking around the country with this, and it's been amazing. Again, I hear from people, how come I didn't know this? How come I wasn't taught this? And if I wanted to do anything with Rebel Falls, number one, I wanted to make it a great page-turner like John's work, which I really admire. And secondly was to explore what was going on our northern border. But you guys just mentioned Belle Boyd. Also wanted to ramp up the role of women in the Civil War. The main protagonist here is a woman named Rory Chase, who's a composite of several folks, but very much, from Auburn, New York, where the Stewards were from, and gets kind of plucked in and is forced to be or becomes a Union spy. And so women often were overlooked, and yet they were on, as you guys well know, passionate and on both sides of the war and did some extraordinary acts. And that's what I also wanted to accent with Rebel Falls.
Yeah, and we have West Virginia, which was formed out of Virginia during the Civil War, and there are so many people here whose families go back to both sides of that fight, which is fascinating in and of itself within the same family.
Yeah. Our relationship status was, it's complicated.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. That's a good way to put it. Tim, we're out of time. Thank you so much for yours. It was wonderful to learn more about this whole subject matter here. Great stuff.
Oh, great to be with you.
I'll
John,
see you again in
at the
June,
next
if not
dinner.
before.
Very good.
All
Thank
right,
you.
take care.
Have a good day, Tim. Stay warm.